Versailles. A palace that became the symbol of absolute power. Here, every hall, every portrait, every whisper was part of a grand mechanism where Louis XIV was not merely a king. He was the sun. The source of all light, all life, all truth. His courtiers were his planets, orbiting in strictly prescribed paths. And his mistresses were the brightest and most fragile of satellites. Their brilliance was reflected, their power borrowed. They shone only for as long as they were bathed in the royal gaze. But there was one woman who dared to forget this rule. She didn't just catch the light, she tried to command it. Her name was Marie Anne de Cossel. The court saw in her the perfect reflection of their monarch, intelligent, passionate, brilliant. They saw her dazzling smile, her influence, her proximity to the throne. They thought they knew her story. A story of a love affair that ended in disgrace. They were wrong. Because behind that smile, behind that perfect facade, lay more than just the resentment of a spurned lover. There, in the depths of her ambition, the most dangerous of conspiracies was taking root. A conspiracy not against the king's life, but against the very essence of his power. A conspiracy against the principle of absolute monarchy itself. This is not a story of punished love. This is the story of a woman who, having been given everything, wanted more. A woman who looked upon the sun and decided she could rival it. And today, we will learn the secret she wielded as a weapon, the risk that proved fatal, and why her punishment was not a swift execution, but 47 long years of oblivion in a stone dungeon. This is the story of the most audacious challenge of the age of Louis the Great. A conspiracy born before a mirror. To understand the fall, one must see the height. And the height of Marie Anne de Cossel was dazzling. The year was 1680. Versailles was not just a palace. It was a meticulously staged performance where every gesture was a code, every glance a message. Hundreds of aristocrats waged an endless war for the attention of the Sun King. And onto this stage, she appeared. Marie Anne de Cossel was not from an ancient aristocratic line. But this was her strength. She was unburdened by the prejudices of the old nobility. She was witty, educated, an exquisite dancer and singer. But her primary weapon was none of these. It was her mind. While the king's previous mistresses were content to be beautiful ornaments, Cossel became his conversationalist. She read Descartes, discussed politics with him, and advised him on matters of state. She was his reflection in the literal sense, someone who understood him implicitly, whose thoughts moved in unison with his own. Louis, weary of the whims and intrigues of his former lovers, was captivated. He saw in her not only passion, but an intellectual companion. And he showered her with favors beyond the wildest dreams of even princesses of the blood, the Château de Choisy with its paradisiacal gardens, the title of Duchess, the highest recognition, a massive annual income. The jewelers and dressmakers of Versailles worked for her alone. She bore him 7 children, living proof of their powerful bond. Her position seemed unshakable. She was not just a mistress, she was virtually a co-ruler. Her word could elevate a minister or ruin a career. It was here, at this peak of glory, that the fatal crack in her destiny began to form. Proximity to the throne is a dangerous drug. Gradually, Cossel began to confuse the reflected light with her own radiance. She grew accustomed to her desires becoming law, to her opinions being treated as truth. She looked into the mirror of Versailles adulation and saw not a mistress, but a woman whose will was equal to the king's. She forgot the ancient maxim of all courts, the king is the sun. And to stare at the sun too directly, for too long, is to be blinded. Or to be consumed. Her rise had been meteoric. But the higher you soar, the more terrible the fall. And the shadow of that fall had already fallen upon the gleaming parquet of Versailles. But nothing lasts forever under the moon. And even less so under the sun, which has a habit of changing its affections. And so, a new, quiet, yet inexorable star appeared in the Versailles sky, Madame de Maintenon. And her ascent was the first, barely perceptible cloud on the clear horizon of Cossel's career. This was an era of great change. Louis, having reached the zenith of his power, was beginning to contemplate sin and the salvation of his soul. The glitter and boisterous festivities had become a burden to him. The intellectual feasts and gallant pleasures gave way to quiet conversations, prayers, and a mood of penitence. Marie Anne de Cossel, whose power was built on wit and worldly brilliance, suddenly found herself obsolete. Her primary weapon, her mind, had become useless. She could feel the ground crumbling beneath her feet. Her power, her influence, her future, everything was evaporating like morning mist in the beam of a sun that had suddenly changed its course. And it was here, in a soul poisoned by fear and wounded pride, that a conspiracy was born, not in the classic sense, with poisons, daggers, and bribed guards. No. This was a far more audacious, more subtle, and therefore more dangerous conspiracy, a plot to use emotional force and blackmail to reshape reality, to reclaim the past, to force the sun to shine as she required. She found her weapon. She learned the king's most terrible, most closely guarded secret, that of his morganatic marriage to Madame de Maintenon. This union, not fully sanctioned by the church and unequal in status, was the monarch's Achilles' heel. And this secret became, for Cossel, not a tool for careful maneuvering, but a cudgel. She made a fatal error. She stopped acting like a disgraced mistress who ought to be humble and began behaving like a wronged, lawful wife. She made demands, hurled reproaches, resorted to blackmail. She dared to stage jealous scenes for the king, tried to dictate terms to him, and openly voiced her contempt for Maintenon. Her conspiracy was a conspiracy against the king's will. A plot to retain her own power by threatening the principle most sacred to Louis, his absolute authority. She looked in the mirror and saw no longer his reflection, but her own, solitary, yet filled with pride. She was challenging not merely a man who had grown cold to her. She was challenging the very idea of absolute monarchy, where a single word from the king could elevate one to the heights or cast them into the abyss. And in that moment, she transformed from an admirable favorite into a problem that needed to be eliminated. The crack in the mirror had become a chasm. October, the year 1707. That day was meant to be like any other, full of conventions and hidden implications. But the illusions were over. The mirror had shattered. Into her chambers marched not bowing courtiers, but guards with swords. No trial, no investigation, not even a public declaration of her guilt. Only the laconic order of the Sun King, delivered in the captain's merciless tone. In this, Louis was quintessential, absolute and impersonal in his wrath. She was taken away that very night. Without the right to pack her belongings, to bid her children farewell, to preserve her dignity. This was not an exile, it was an abduction. A last look at the lights of Versailles, which had been her world, her stage, her everything. Every turn of the carriage wheels on the cobblestones hammered out the same rhythm. It is over. It is over. It is over. Her new abode was not merely a prison, but a chain of fortresses, Châteauneuf, then Dijon, then others. Her lavish apartments were replaced by a stone cage. The rustle of silk gave way to the screech of iron bolts. The glitter of 1,000 candles in the Hall of Mirrors was replaced by the solitary flame of a tallow candle, casting grotesque shadows on bare walls. The world that had once lain at her feet had shrunk to the size of a cell, a few paces across. At first, hope remained. She wrote. Letters filled first with anger and demands, then with memories and pleas, and finally, with despair and anguish. She appealed to their shared past, to his reason, to his mercy. She tried to reach the reflection of the loving man she had once known. But her messages vanished into silence. They were swallowed by the perfect bureaucratic machine created to erase her from reality. Her voice, once capable of influencing the politics of Europe, could no longer carry beyond the walls of her dungeon. And so began her long, methodical erasure from history. 47 years. 47 years of confinement. She outlived Louis himself. She outlived his son, the Grand Dauphin. She outlived his grandson. Beyond her prison walls, alliances crumbled, wars began, eras changed. But her time had stopped. Her prison became something more terrible than stone and iron. Her prison was absolute, total oblivion. The mirror that had once reflected a powerful woman now showed only a ghost, finishing out her days in complete obscurity. Her conspiracy against the crown had failed. But the price was far more terrible than a swift execution. The price was an entire life, stolen and buried alive. So what was her true crime? Why was fate so merciless to a woman who once embodied the very essence of Versailles grandeur? The answer lies not in a lover's quarrel, nor even in jealousy. The reason was the challenge. A challenge posed to the very nature of absolute power. Louis could forgive much: intrigue, extravagance, even marital infidelity. But he could not forgive an assault on the fundamental principle upon which his entire reign was built, the principle of his unconditional authority. Cossel committed the unpardonable. From a favorite whose role was to reflect his will, she transformed into a rival who contested it. She attempted to become a second sun in a sky that, by definition, could have only one. This is why her punishment was so severe and, more importantly, so prolonged. It was not merely an act of revenge. It was a message to the entire court, to the entire world: see what befalls those who dare place their own will above the king's. Her fate became a living lesson, stretched out over decades. A lesson that even the brightest star can be extinguished by a single movement of the monarch's hand. But the story of Marie Anne de Cossel is not just a tale of power and downfall. It is a story that tells us something important about the nature of the human soul. Her letters from captivity are a unique document, charting an evolution from pride to despair, from rage to resignation. In them lies the profound anguish of a woman who could not reconcile herself to becoming obsolete. Who could not accept that her brilliant mind, her education, her will, everything that constituted her very essence, was rendered useless by the simple fact of the king's disfavor. Her legacy is complex and multifaceted. On one hand, it is a cautionary tale about the price of ambition in a world ruled by a single man. On the other, it is a story of incredible fortitude, for to endure so many years in confinement without completely breaking is itself a form of victory. She became a symbol of the peril of being an individual in a system that values individuality only for as long as it is convenient. Marie Anne de Cossel died, forgotten by almost all. But her story lives on. It lives as a reminder that behind the glitter of Versailles mirrors, there always lay shadows. Shadows of ambition, passion, and tragedy. And her shadow is one of the most poignant, the shadow of a woman who wanted to be the sun's equal, yet was forever condemned to remain in its shade.